In Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, the clock showed exactly 11:15 p.m. in Captain Ibrahim Traoré's private study. A meeting that would change the world was about to take place. The room's thick curtains were tightly drawn. With special security systems, on the table, a video conference screen protected by state-of-the-art encryption technology glowed. The name appearing on the other side was someone who could upset all global power balances. Chinese President Xi Jinping. The meeting to be held tonight would not only determine the fate between two countries, but would shape Africa's economic future, determine the destiny of gold reserves worth $28 billion, and ignite the fuse of a new war among world powers. As Traoré stood before the screen, he reviewed the file in his hand once more. This file contained the exact coordinates of reserves hidden in Burkina Faso's territory, which geologists called Africa's greatest gold treasure. The results of 3 months of secret geological studies were shocking. Burkina Faso's northern regions lay the largest gold deposits ever discovered. Thus, reserves with a total value exceeding $28 billion had the power to place a small African country at the center of the world economy. But more importantly, when these goals were in the right hands, they could be the key to all of Africa's economic independence. This discovery, of course, had not remained secret. French intelligence services had learned about the existence of the reserves through their agent Sun in Burkina Faso emergency. Meetings were being held at the Elysee Palace, developing strategies to protect France's economic hegemony in Africa. The American CIA had also become aware of the situation and began sending special teams to the region. But Traoré was determined to ride his own rules in this great game, and this determination had brought him to this secret meeting with Xi Jinping, one of the world's most powerful leaders, when the video conference connection was established. The mutual greetings were formal but respectful. Xi Jinping in his private study in Beijing, Traoré in his office in Ouagadougou. There were thousands of kilometers between the two leaders, but the topic they would discuss would shape the future of both countries. "Mr. President," began Traoré, "the topic we will discuss today will affect not only the relationship between two countries, but the economic future of all." Africa, Xi Jinping's response was diplomatic but clear. "Captain Traoré, as China, we are ready to support Africa's development. We eagerly await your proposal." Those words seemed like polite diplomatic language on the surface, but actually signaled the beginning of a global power struggle. The gold reserves in Traoré's hands were a perfect opportunity for China's strategic goals in Africa. Traoré began the conversation by sharing geological reports. "Mr. President, according to our experts' assessment, there are 2,500 tons of gold reserves in our country's northern regions. The extractable portion of these reserves is approximately 1,800 tons with current technologies. When calculated at current gold prices, the total value of these reserves exceeds $28 billion. These figures caused even Xi Jinping's eyes to sparkle. While $28 billion was an astronomical figure for a small African country, it was also extremely important for China's global strategies. Within the scope of China's new Silk Road project, secure gold supply from Africa was a strategic priority. And now before him was a leader who owned this gold and was ready to cooperate. "These data are very impressive," said Xi Jinping. "As China, we can provide the necessary technology, financing, and expertise for developing these reserves. But of course, this would require a comprehensive cooperation agreement." These words seemed like a technical cooperation proposal on the surface, but were actually laying the foundations for a strategic alliance that could change the global balance of power. Traoré's response was also strategic. "Mr. President, we also want this cooperation. But what's important for us is that this agreement preserves Burkina Faso's sovereignty and considers our people's interests. Due to past colonial experiences, we insist on the principle of equal partnership." This sentence was the most critical, the point of the conversation. Traoré was clearly referencing France's colonial past while advocating for a new model of cooperation. Xi Jinping understood this message very well. China's Africa strategy emphasized that it was different from the West's colonial model, and this greatly interested African leaders. "Of course," said Xi Jinping, "China's Africa policy is based on the principles of mutual benefit and equal partnership. We are against colonial mentality. Our proposal is to establish a joint investment company to develop Burkina Faso's gold reserves. In this company, Burkina Faso will have a 60% stake, China 40%. This way, you will have the final say in decisions. This proposal surprised Traoré. China's making such an offer was very different from traditional Western companies' approach to Africa. Usually, Western companies wanted to maintain control, viewing African countries merely as raw material suppliers, but China was proposing a different model. This is a very interesting proposal, said Traoré, but how will financing be provided? How will gold extraction technology be transferred? And most importantly, how will international reactions to this agreement be managed? Xi Jinping's response was prepared. For financing, China Development Bank is ready to provide a $10 billion loan, interest rate 2%, repayment period 25 years. For technology transfer, China's most advanced mining companies will be involved in the project. Regarding international reactions, this is a completely legal and legitimate commercial agreement. The magnitude of this offer surprised even Traoré. A $10 billion loan was close to half of Burkina Faso's annual GDP. This money would be sufficient not only for gold extraction, but also to significantly improve the country's infrastructure. Roads, bridges, hospitals, schools. Many things could be rebuilt, Mr. President, said Traoré. This offer is truly very generous. But my concern is that this agreement will draw the reaction of other powers in Africa, especially France. Our former colonial powers being uncomfortable. Xi Jinping's smile could be felt even through the screen. Captain Traoré, the 21st century, is no longer the colonial age. Every country has the right to cooperate with whichever country it wants while protecting its own interests. As China, we will give you full support in this matter. Those words actually summarize the essence of China's Africa strategy. China wanted to break African countries' dependence on the West and expand its own sphere of influence, and Burkina Faso's gold reserves were a perfect tool for realizing this strategy. As the conversation progressed, the details of the agreement began to clarify. The joint company would be established under the name Chino-Burkina Gold Corporation. China would initially invest $5 billion, bring modern mining equipment, and deploy 2,000 Chinese experts. Burkina Faso would provide gold reserves and local workforce. More importantly, the agreement was not limited to gold extraction alone. China would also establish gold processing facilities in Burkina Faso, so processed gold could be exported instead of raw gold. This would significantly increase the country's added value. Another important point, said Xi Jinping, is that this agreement could serve as a model for other African countries. We could start a new era of China-Africa cooperation. This sentence made Traoré's eyes sparkle. He was making an agreement that could contribute not only to his own countries, but to all of Africa's economic independence. This was a historical responsibility. Mr. President, said Traoré, are ready to make this agreement, but we have some conditions. First, full compliance with environmental standards. Second, training and employment of local workforce. Third, spending most of the revenue on education and health services. Xi Jinping's response was positive. We fully accept these conditions. As China, we support sustainable development. We will create a separate fund of $500 million for local population education. At this point, the meeting began to get into technical details: which regions would be mined, which technologies would be used, how environmental impact assessment would be conducted. Everything was being planned within minutes. But at this time, 6,000 kilometers away from Ouagadougou, bells were ringing in Paris. French intelligence services had become aware of Traoré's secret meeting. An emergency meeting was called at the Élysée Palace. On President Emmanuel Macron's desk were gold maps of Burkina Faso. And these maps showed that France's 150-year hegemony in Africa was in danger. If this agreement is realized, said the French foreign minister, China's economic influence in Africa will become uncontrollable. Burkina Faso's gold will sit at the center of China's global strategy. Macron's response was harsh and clear. We must prevent this agreement. We will try every means. Thus, words showed how determined France was to protect its interest in Africa. Burkina Faso's gold was not just a mining project, but a strategic asset. At the center of global power struggle, after midnight, the meeting between Traoré and Xi Jinping ended. The basic framework of the agreement had been determined: Details would be clarified in subsequent meetings, but this first meeting was a historic step. For the first time, an African country was making an equal partnership agreement with a major power while maintaining full control over its own natural resources. Mr. President, not only between two countries, but also for Africa's future. I hope this will be the beginning of a new era. Xi Jinping's response also carried historical weight. Captain Traoré, this agreement is truly historic. It will be the finest example of cooperation between China and Africa. When the video conference ended, Traoré paused for a moment and thought the agreement he had signed tonight could make Burkina Faso one of the region's richest countries. But at the same time, it would also make it a target for global powers. The next morning, the first reflections of the agreement began to be felt. The first news about Burkina Faso's gold reserves began to appear in international media. Reuters, BBC, CNN, everyone was following this story. French media harshly criticized the agreement. News with headlines like China's colonization of Africa were published. But African media characterized the agreement as a historical victory. France's reaction was not limited to the media. Through diplomatic channels, pressure began to be applied to Burkina Faso. The French. America also sent a special representative to the region, but the most interesting reaction came from other African countries. Ghana, Mali, Senegal, all announced they wanted to make similar agreements. Traoré's step was creating a domino effect. Meanwhile, there was also activity in China. China Development Bank approved the $10 billion loan. China's largest mining companies began sending teams to Burkina Faso. Chinese media described the agreement as New Era cooperation. The second phase of the agreement took place a month later. This time, Traoré went to Beijing. In China's capital, detailed plans were made for developing gold reserves. China's most advanced technologies would be transferred to Burkina Faso. In the Beijing meetings, the scope of the agreement grew even larger. China proposed not only gold extraction, but also developing Burkina Faso's infrastructure. Airport, roads, power plants, important projects would be built with Chinese financing and technology. This agreement, said Xi Jinping, in the Beijing meeting, will be an important project of China. Africa cooperation, we will make Burkina Faso one of Africa's developing economies. These words excited Dr. He could see that his country could become one of Africa's important economic centers in a reasonable time, but at the same time, he also realized the challenges this great project would bring. France's reaction was harsh, as expected. Some economic restrictions were applied to Burkina Faso. France reduced its aid to the country. The EU suspended some cooperation programs due to democracy concerns, but these pressures did not stop Traoré. With China's support, the country's economy continued to grow. Development of gold reserves began. The first gold extraction was realized within 8 months with the start of gold extraction operations. Burkina Faso's economy changed significantly. The country's GDP grew 18% within 2 years. The unemployment rate decreased significantly. Investments in education and health services significantly improved the people's quality of life. More importantly, the agreement's effect spread to other African countries. Mali signed a similar agreement with China. Ghana decided to develop its gold reserves with Chinese companies. Senegal made a comprehensive economic cooperation agreement with China. These developments began to shake France's traditional influence. In Africa, some countries using the CFR, franc began researching alternative currency options. French companies began losing some of their projects in Africa. Results were discussed. Burkina Faso's gold production had reached an annual level of 65 tons. The country's income had increased by $8 billion. Mr. President, said Traoré, this agreement has been an important success, not only for two countries but also for Africa. China's friendship has contributed to Africa's futures. Response was also meaningful. Captain, this is just the beginning. China-Africa cooperation will strengthen even more in the coming years in the second year of the agreement. Burkina Faso had begun to rank among Africa's rapidly growing economies. The country's gold reserves had gained an important share in the regional gold market. This made Burkina Faso an important player in regional gold trade. China's strategy in Africa was also succeeding. Faso's success encouraged other African countries to also cooperate with China. China's trade volume in Africa increased significantly. But success also came with new challenges. But Burkina Faso's increasing wealth also increased security problems in the region. Terror groups began targeting gold mines. China provided technical support to ensure security. France continued to strive to maintain its influence in Africa. French President Macron expressed his concerns about maintaining balances in Africa, but these concerns found limited response among African leaders. In the third year, Burkina Faso had achieved a solid position among Africa's developing economies. Per capita income had doubled. The country's infrastructure had significantly improved. Ouagadougou had become a more modern city. This success also increased Traoré's prestige in Africa. He was now seen as one of Africa's respected leaders. Not just Burkina Faso's, other African countries began to benefit from his experiences. This agreement, said Traoré on the third anniversary, has become a beautiful example of how Africa can develop. By keeping our own resources under our own control, we can grow through equal partnerships. China's Africa strategy had also been fruitful. Gold exports from Africa to China had increased significantly. Chinese companies were carrying out projects worth billions of dollars in Africa. In the fourth year, the agreement's effect was felt at a regional level. In the Sahel region, China-Africa cooperation had become an important force in gold trade. Western countries tried to adapt to this new balance of power. In the fifth year of the agreement, 40% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves had been extracted. The country now had an important position in gold production in the region. This success had demonstrated Africa's potential at a regional level. Traoré had taken his place among Africa's respected leaders during this 5-year process. His model was being followed with interest in Africa. China-Africa cooperation had begun to affect the dynamics of the regional economy. This agreement, said Jinping on the 5th anniversary, has become a beautiful example of successful international cooperation. The partnership between China and Africa has offered a new model to the region. In the 6th year of the agreement, Burkina Faso had undergone a significant transformation. The country had become one of the region's developing technology centers. China's technology transfer had strengthened local technological capacity. Investments in the education sector also began to bear fruit. Burkina Faso's universities entered among the region's quality educational institutions. Chinese scholarships sent hundreds of Burkina students to study in China. Developments in the health sector were also noteworthy. Hospitals built with China's support had become the region's modern health facilities. Average life expectancy increased by 8 years. In the 7th year, Burkina Faso's success became an inspiring example in Africa. The success, called the Burkina Faso experience, became a practical example of how Africa could develop. China's investments in Africa also reached significant levels. Chinese companies were carrying out projects worth $180 billion in Africa. This made China one of Africa's important investment partners. In the 8th year, the agreement's regional impact became even more apparent. In the Sahel region, China-Africa cooperation had become an important economic force. This cooperation began to affect regional development dynamics. Traoré had become a leader, shaping not only his country's but the region's future. During this process, he was respected as one of Africa's modern-era leaders. In the 9th year, Burkina Faso was now among Africa's developed economies. The country's development indices had surpassed many countries in the region. This was a concrete example of Africa's potential. The agreement emerged. 70% of Burkina Faso's gold reserves had been extracted. The country had earned $28 billion in revenue. This revenue had significantly transformed the country. Traoré, in his speech on the 10th anniversary, said this agreement was not just an economic success, but Africa's realization of its own potential. We proved that we can write our own destiny. With our own resources, Jinping's response was also meaningful. This agreement became a beautiful example of international cooperation. The partnership between China and Africa offered a new development model to the region. Burkina Faso's success showed all of Africa's potential. Traoré looked out the window at Ouagadougou. The city was very different from that poor, dusty place he had seen 10 years ago. Modern buildings, wide streets, technology centers. Burkina Faso had now become one of Africa's sources of pride. The gold reserves worth $28 billion had become not just money but a symbol of Africa's independence.